Welcome everybody to the first Fall 2021 seminar hosted by the MS Chadha Center for Global India at Princeton University. I am Anu Ramaswamy. I am the faculty director of the Chadha Center, and I work broadly on the topic of sustainable cities. I have faculty appointments across India Studies, Civil and Environmental Engineering, and the Princeton Environmental Institute. I'm absolutely thrilled today to be welcoming more than 100 people who are joining us via Zoom from across the US and also from India. So welcome to all the webinar participants, and a quick instruction to use the Q&A button for any questions that you have for the panelists, because the chat button is disabled on Zoom webinars. And so we're gathered here today to this panel discussion that's going to be talking about Kamala Harris's historic candidacy as Vice President of the United States. And we will explore this topic in terms of what it means for India, for the Indian diaspora, and for US politics. We are absolutely honored today to have a distinguished panel of speakers who will address this topic from different disciplinary lenses. And I'll provide a brief introduction to each of the speakers. Our first speaker will be Manisha Sinha. Manisha is the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut and the Mellon Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the American Antiquarian Society. She's the author of The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in Antebellum, South Carolina, which was named one of the 10 best books on slavery by Politico, and recently was featured in the New York Times 1619 Project. Her second book is the multiple award-winning The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition. And I want to welcome Manisha today. Welcome. Our second speaker is Professor Eddie Glaude. He is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor and Chair of African American Studies at Princeton University. Glaude is the author of several important books, including Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, which has been described as one of the most imaginative and daring books of the 21st century. His most recent book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own, was released in June 2020 and has been hailed as precisely the witness we need for our treacherous times. Glaude is also a columnist for Time magazine and a regular contributor for MSNBC. He hails from Moss Point, Mississippi, and is a graduate of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome, Eddie. Our third speaker will be Professor Karthik Ramakrishnan, a professor of public policy and political science at the University of California at Riverside, and founding director of its Center for Social Innovation. He has published many articles and 7 books, including most recently Citizenship Reimagined and Framing Immigrants. He's written several op-eds and appeared in more than 1,000 news stories, and was named to the Frederick Douglass 200 list. He's currently working on projects related to racial equity in philanthropy and regional development. Karthik Ramakrishnan is also the founding director of AAPI, a survey of political attitudes of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, which he'll talk about in the panel discussion. Karthik holds a BA in International Relations from Brown University and a PhD in politics from Princeton University. Welcome back to Princeton, Karthik. Our fourth speaker will be Professor Bidisha Biswas, Professor of Political Science at Western Washington University. She previously served as a Franklin Fellow Policy Advisor on South Asia to the US Department of State. Bidisha's research areas are international security, immigration, and diaspora politics. She obtained her PhD in government and politics from the University of Maryland, College Park. Her recent writings have been on US-India international relations, really relevant to our discussion today. Welcome, Bidisha. I'm also excited to be serving as moderator for this panel, along with Gyan Prakash, who is the Dayton Stockton Professor of History at Princeton University. Gyan is the leading authority on the history of modern India with focus on urban history, environmental history, and post-colonial thought and politics. Both Gyan and I will moderate the panel discussion and field questions from the audience as we get into the Q&A sessions. So with that, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the vision for how this panel is going to play out. Our vision for the panel comes from what you see in this slide right here. As we all know, Kamala Harris is the first Black American, the first woman of color to be nominated for vice president of a major party in the US. She's also the first Indian American, South Asian American, and Jamaican American to have this high honor. Her candidacy has sparked a tremendous amount of interest across diverse communities across the US, as you can see in this slide, and also among women broadly speaking, as only the third major party VP candidate in the US, of course, following Hillary Clinton's historic presidential run in 2016. It has also sparked a tremendous amount of interest in India, as you can see in the second slide. Her use of the word chitti, which means aunt in Tamil, or more specifically, your mother's younger sister or little mother, got so much excitement, both in newspapers, in Google searches, and there are posters celebrating her candidacy in India, as you can see on this slide. And overall, there's the feeling that one of our own has been nominated to this high honor and to this high responsibility. So what we're going to do here today is to dig deeper behind all of this, the multiple identities that Kamala Harris's nomination represents, drawing upon diverse disciplinary perspectives. First, we want to understand the historical nature of Kamala Harris's candidacy, literally in the context of history. What are the forces that led up to this moment in time, going back to the civil rights movement, and even potentially behind or prior to that? We'll open with remarks providing this historical perspective from Professor Manisha Sinha. Professor Eddie Glaude will follow her, and he will talk about both the importance as well as the pitfalls of thinking about multiple identities that Kamala Harris represents. He'll help us navigate the complexity of these identities and also the pitfalls of thinking about her solely in terms of these identities. We'll follow that with political science perspectives from the Asian American Political Attitude Survey that has been the brainchild of Professor Karthik Ramakrishnan. He'll speak to what the surveys are telling us, both in the context of Harris's nomination, as well as the broader context of the 1.8 million Indian Americans who are registered to vote in this year's election. And finally, we'll take a more of a forward-looking speculative perspective with Professor Bidisha Biswas, exploring the hypothetical scenario of a Biden-Harris administration. What would that mean for US-India relationships, for US-India politics, and international relationships, broadly speaking? And so without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Manisha Sinha to start with her opening remarks. Manisha, over to you.
Thank you, Anu, for that introduction. So I thought in my remarks today, I would just highlight some of the connections between Indian Americans and African Americans historically in the United States. As I mentioned in my op-ed for the New York Times, we all know the story of how Gandhian notions of nonviolent resistance influenced Dr. King and many civil rights activists. And today I wanted to just sort of draw that connection in the longue durée, going right back to the era of the American Revolution. When I was researching my book on abolition, I found that there were many Bengali Lascars, as they were called, sailors, who ended up in the Northeast, in ports like Boston and New York. And many of them were enslaved, like African Americans. And so I found in the minutes of the New York Manumission Society and other abolition societies that they were fighting for the freedom of these people of Indian descent, along with that of African Americans. I also found an instance of a Black abolitionist, one of the first Black doctors in this country, who was actually descended from a Frenchman and an Indian woman. They called her a Hindu woman. His name was John DeGrasse, and he fought in the Civil War. I found instances of Indian Americans who actually fought with the United States colored troops during the Civil War. So if you look at the history of the Indian presence, in this country, it's been a long presence, and it has somewhat been interconnected with the history of African Americans. For instance, I found even within the abolition movement, there were many abolitionists, especially followers of William Lloyd Garrison, who were very anti-imperialist and who criticized British rule in India. During the 1857 revolt, they defended the Indian revolt and said, the way the British talked about the Indians as cruel natives, etc., reminded them a lot of the ways in which slaveholders talked about slave rebellions. I also found an instance that jumped out at me as an Indian American who does African American history of Raja Ram Mohan Roy's locks of hair being sold in the Boston anti-slavery bazaar, the way that the locks of hair of British abolitionists like Wilberforce and Clarkson were sold. So all these interconnections, as an Indian American who does the history of slavery, abolition, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, it really did jump out at me, and I did mention them all in my book on the slave's cause. The 20th century story is much better known to us. We also know of the Indian migrations to the Caribbean as indentured labor, the Punjabi migrations to the West Coast, Bengali migrations to the East Coast. All those stories are better known. But the story of Kamala Harris and her mother, Shamla, is not that unusual. In fact, we know that by the time Shamla came to Berkeley and became involved in the African American Association, there was a long history of this. And there was nothing as unusual as we would normally see it. Finally, I'd like to say that these connections between Indian Americans and African Americans is a political project. It's not natural. There are, of course, many instances where we Indians can be rather parochial when it comes to caste, religion, even the region from which we are. And that, in a way, does prevent us from seeing our common humanity, let's say, with other people of color, and certainly with African Americans. And a lot of immigrants to this country, their tendency, one of the ways in which they have assimilated in this country is to, in fact, look down on African Americans, to adopt racism in order to advance themselves. So we also have that history. So there's nothing natural about this connection, but I must say that we must see it as a political project, and one that overlapped with the Black struggle for freedom and the anti-imperialist struggles in India. How they overlapped in the 20th century is, in fact, quite remarkable. And I will just end with talking about the great Black scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois, who not only made connections with Indian nationalists in the early 20th century, but he also wrote a novel called The Dark Princess, in which maybe he was presciently predicting the rise of Kamala Devi Harris. He talked about an Indian princess who marries an African-American man, and that their child becomes the sort of messiah, the savior of the American Republic. So I found that really odd when I read that novel and I read Kamala Harris's personal history, that this was there in somebody's literary imagination early in the 20th century, and now in the 21st, we are seeing this historic nomination of Kamala Harris as the vice presidential nominee of the Democratic Party. Thank you for listening. And now I will hand the mic back to Anu.
Thank you, Manisha. Following that beautiful story, I'd like to turn to Professor Glaude to help us think through navigating the multiple racial identities that candidates like Senator Harris represent, as well as the tension of creating distance between them, and the perils of focusing on identity over policy. So with that, I welcome Professor Eddie Glaude to offer his comments. Eddie?
I want us to think about, just really quickly, I don't want me to think about it, I want us to think about it over the course of the panel. What is this about? Right? Is this in some way, just to echo something Manisha said earlier, is this a way of generating a sort of distance that's not quite an explicit distancing? I don't know. I just want us to think about it a little bit more. And something similar happened in 2008. Obama had been identified as African American, but as he made his ascent, suddenly he became Kenyan, biracial, and the like. What is it about this move, this shift, and then the necessary move to somewhat mute Blackness in an interesting sort of way in that moment? So part of what I want us to do is to think about the mobilization of identity, the mobilization of her Indian identity. And it was such a beautiful moment. Not only did she mention, and sorry if I mispronounced the word, chatti, not only did she mention that, she also brought in the ancestors of all of these Black women that made her possible at the same time. But what gets pulled out is really fascinating. I want us to think about the perils of identity here, the perils of identification and representation actually standing in for politics. What's fascinating about what Manisha said is the connection had everything to do with anti-colonial struggle, right? What does it mean to just simply identify with Indianness or Blackness and allow those identifications to mute actual political positions? One of the interesting dimensions of her presidential campaign was that there were Black activists in California who were deeply suspicious of her positions around the criminal justice system. There were folks who were questioning her policy record as the Attorney General of California. Now, we could debate this. I think she could defend it, but there was this interesting policy debate around Kamala Harris at the very moment in which many Black women were embracing her, lifting her up. Many members of AKAs and Delta Sigma Theta, those Black sororities, were lifting her up. There was still policy debate. So what happens when, this is my third point, when pride displaces politics? When we begin to think that the fact of Indianness or the fact of Blackness can stand in for a particular political position. We should think about Bobby Jindal. We should think about Nikki Haley. Some may be proud. I'm deeply suspicious of those folks. Just like I'm deeply suspicious of Tim Scott, I was deeply suspicious of some of the policy positions of Barack Obama. So as we think about how identities are mobilized to activate electorates, we have to think about the perils, and we have to think about the politics. And I hope we get a chance to discuss all of that over the course of our conversation. Back to you, Anu.
Wonderful. So that was a perfect segue for me to hand off to Karthik and tell us about the politics. What are the political, what are the political attitudes? What are the policy positions that Asian Americans and Indian Americans specifically are interested in? And so with that, I'd like to invite Karthik to speak.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. And Dr. Glaude, I look forward to the Q&A where we get to mix it up a little bit. Happy to be here, especially as an alum of Princeton. I've been in California, that's where I went first. In fact, in some ways, I guess it's very relevant to this conversation. I worked at a think tank in San Francisco right after grad school, right around the time that Kamala Harris got elected as a DA, and I've been kind of observing her ascent since, and I think there's a lot to unpack. She's been a very private individual, and she's risen through the ranks largely as a party insider. That's the way that she's risen to the top. And part of the way I read, I think there's a certain aspect of her public Black identity that's very much, I think, been a part of her public persona. But in general, when she ran for the Senate, she had one press conference and she had one debate. She has largely not been an open book the way Barack Obama was literally an open book well before he even thought of running for the presidency. So I think we see some interesting steps and missteps, I would say, in terms of how this identity has been grappled with publicly. But I'm really happy to see the way it's landing now. Although I also understand the way Eddie said, there might be some troubling aspects to the way that people may be constrained or may be forced to highlight certain aspects of their identity to placate various political needs and causes. So that I just wanted to say that, just especially coming out of those remarks, I really think there's rich, fertile ground here. So in the case of Indian Americans, it's relevant because among some Indian Americans, they thought that she was not emphasizing her Indian identity enough, her Indian heritage enough, as if she had something to be embarrassed of. Now, no one would mistake Kamala Harris to be a Bobby Jindal, even though he was monoracial Indian as opposed to biracial. He was not someone literally who was comfortable in his own skin, right? And this is something that we saw in 2016. And when it was the chance to be able to talk about himself, he didn't want to be seen. He didn't want to emphasize the fact that he was a child of immigrants, and really was not talking much about his heritage. Now, there's some good reasons for that, especially running as a Republican, but I think even for Harris, to be tagged as foreign, especially given all of the baggage that comes with that Barack Obama experienced, having one foreign-born parent, now having two foreign-born parents, and what that might mean, I imagine has something to do with the way that she was more private about that kind of identity and background. But here we are, and what's amazing is that the vice presidential pick was almost a kind of made-for-TV moment, right? So it was interesting because all of a sudden you had reporters who were calling me, I'm sure many others as well, but in the course of 3 days, I swear I must have gotten about 12 to 15 phone calls, all trying to dig deeper into her identity. And part of me was like, she ran for president for close to a year. You had all this chance to find out more about who she is. But it is the fact that it is like a made for reality TV moment. There is the big reveal, right? There's all that anticipation, and then the dam broke. And what was really heartening, and what I would say is that even towards the end of her presidential campaign, she was much more comfortable, right? She did the YouTube segment, or I think Twitter video segment with Mindy Kaling. She went on late night TV and she talked about those aspects of her trips to India, the kind of foods that she enjoyed, which includes a variety of foods. But it was remarkable how flat-footed mainstream media were, because they had all of that material that was pretty apparent. But what was amazing, though, is that I think there was already a fair number of Indian Americans that were inspired and excited by her being more public about those aspects of her identity towards the end of her presidential campaign before she dropped out. So much so that when this big reveal came, it was an outpouring of pride, right? So in my mind, it was not just important in terms of what identity she claimed, but who claimed her, right? But Indian Americans claiming her, Jamaican Americans claiming her, I would say second-generation immigrants of any stripe claiming her, women of color claiming her, even white women claiming her, because they sensed the historic opportunity. They read their stories into her story. So that was really remarkable. It was also interesting to see the news coverage, right? The dominant news coverage in India before then that was generating a lot of attention was the Howdy Modi rally, when President Trump joined Narendra Modi, President Trump's trip to India, all of that high-profile coverage. And now you had someone whose family photos look like family photos of many of us when we've gone back to visit India. there was a kind of genuineness and just down-to-earthness about it that was very different from something that was manufactured specifically with a political aim in mind. So what does that mean for Indian Americans? First of all, there was much higher name recognition among Indian Americans about who she was in 2018 when we did a survey of Asian Americans. We also did a survey in 2019, and again, you saw much higher name recognition. Again, people want to claim her, which is just as important, right, as whatever she claims as important parts of her identity. And what we've seen now, I mean, Indian Americans are the strongest democratic leaning of any of the Asian American groups. If you want to think about it, their democratic lean is somewhere between Latinos and African Americans, and that's been pretty consistent over time. But we just released this data because the big question was, how much would Indian Americans be persuaded by all of this, at least symbolic outreach by President Trump and the Trump administration? I say symbolic because on a host of policies, including trying to attack Obamacare, trying to reduce immigration, cutting H-1Bs, eliminating the H-4 work authorization program, and many more, Indian Americans are by and large on the opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to issues. So if you want to kind of balance Trump's kind of charm offensive, if you will, that was built up over several months, and Nikki Haley is part of that, and then Kamala Harris coming relatively late in this game and this big reveal, what do we find? What we found is that President Trump has indeed made some inroads among Indian American voters. He went from 16% of the vote in 2016 to now 28%, with 6% that are undecided. So there has been some movement up. One thing I have not talked about, and I'm hoping to do some more analysis and writing over the weekend, is that we see a gender gap in the Indian American community. Now, Indian American men do support Biden much more than they do over Trump. But the spread that we see is a 20-point spread. So Indian American women are much more likely to support Biden-Harris than Trump-Pence. Now, the beauty is we did our survey in the summer, and the nomination cut about halfway through that data collection. So I thought, how much of this is Indian American women being more inspired after the Harris nomination? Actually, it turns out that both Indian American men and women increased their support for Biden and Harris after Harris's nomination. So it does look like heritage might have played a role. Although we see that among Chinese Americans too, so you can't read too much into that. But what it does seem is that President Trump has actually started to separate out men of color from women of color. And that's something we're seeing in other communities as well. So I think it's really important to see Kamala Harris and her candidacy and her identity, not only as a second generation immigrant, all these identities were talked about, but in the context of President Trump. Some people say that in many ways, Harris is the polar opposite of Trump on so many dimensions. She's very Obama-esque in a lot of ways, as Eddie has pointed out. And I think it'll be really fascinating. And I'll just say personally for me, you try to keep as much distance. I'm not registered with either party. I run surveys. I try to, not have too much of a rooting interest, although it's really difficult if you care about our democracy not to have a rooting interest in any of this stuff. But I'll just say personally, when she said Chitti, as a Tamil, as a Tamilian, often when you see Indian Americans talked about, and just go to the restaurants, it's mostly Punjabi. It's a very kind of North Indian Punjabi culture that is dominant in our understanding of what it means to be Indian American. To have someone who talks about her walks on Besant Nagar Beach, which is just one beach north of where my wife's family is from, to have that level of specificity and authenticity, right? And to talk about the food that she loves, right, in terms of idlis and dosas, that kind of specificity to me speaks to an authenticity where, sure, you might say it's pandering, but it's a very specific kind of pandering. She is not trying to be pan-Indian, let alone pan-Asian. And that to me is very refreshing to see. I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A.
Wonderful, Karthik. And I have to say, I am also from South India, and Gyan has relatives in Chennai, and we all felt that, that tug over there, including many members of my family. But we'll circle back on this point. But moving forward, I think you've spoken really interestingly about the gender gap, and also what are the policy and political intersections with identity. And this is a good segue to introduce our final fourth speaker to present her opening remarks, and then we'll have discussion. So let me hand over to Bidisha Biswas.
Thank you, Anu. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here. I'm delighted to join this panel. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about the future, which is always a little bit risky, but I will try. So where would US-India relations go should a Biden-Harris administration come into power? I'll start by saying that Kamala Harris, during her time in the Senate, really focused on her work in the Senate Judiciary Committee. So she didn't have a very big footprint in terms of foreign policy. Now, I'm sure that would change were she to become vice president. But that really means that in a Biden-Harris administration, on day 1, day 30, day 60, it would really be President Biden who would be driving the foreign policy because he has decades and decades of experience in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, in the Obama administration. And throughout his career, or at least dating back to the George W. Bush administration, he's been a very big advocate for India, a really strong supporter of stronger defense ties and economic ties between the two countries. So keeping that in mind, when I think of bilateral relations, I think of two umbrellas. The first is the bread and butter side of things, the material interests. Top in that list is China, a very shared kind of sense of concern about Chinese influence in the Asia-Pacific region. I would say that a Biden-Harris administration would be much more strategic in involving India in a partnership, broad spectrum effort to contain Chinese influence. Whereas President Trump, he likes to sell things. He's been really focused on defense sales to India, not really a lot beyond that. So I think that would be to India's benefit. Trade is a very sticky issue between the two countries. It was in the Obama years, Bush years, Trump years. The Indian government has its own domestic priorities. They don't gel well with the US's desire to see the Indian market opening up. So I think that will continue to be sticky. I think it's also important to note that while Prime Minister Modi and his party are very focused on a particular political and social agenda in India, they're not as focused on an economic agenda. There's a tremendous amount of internal divisions about how to grow the Indian economy. And Prime Minister Modi hasn't really articulated a very clear vision there. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there, but it's consistently an issue. Something that I think will be really important for the US moving forward is working on clean energy cooperation. This was a big push on part of the Obama-Biden administration. They worked very closely with India and the Paris Climate Accords on building technological cooperation issues. And all of that fell by the wayside when Trump came into power. So I think that will change, and that's something that I'm very excited about. So those are the bread and butter issues, but bilateral relations are much more than just material interests. It's about values. It's about a shared political history, which is something that Manisha spoke very compellingly about. So India and the US are famously the world's two largest democracies, and perhaps also famously, neither country has really been an exemplar in democratic governance processes in the past few years. But the terrain in India is both more troubled and more troubling, a variety of reasons. The administration has been pretty silent on this, not really a priority for them. And there is some expectation that a Biden-Harris administration would be more interested in promoting democracy worldwide and therefore also in India. I would say that coming in, the Biden-Harris administration cannot really claim to do a lot to change the trajectory of Indian politics, right? Because India is its own sovereign political state. Mr. Modi is in power because Indian voters voted for him, and so that's really not something for the U.S. government to comment on. I think they will probably say a little bit more, but not a whole lot more, because I think, firstly, the interests sort of trump everything else, but also just because, again, this is something for the Indian political system to figure out. And I think this is where Kamala Harris becomes very important. She actually has said a few things that seem to be critical of the Indian government's authoritarian policies. They were actually very, very mild statements, and they got massive pushback from some Indian Hindu nationalists, I would say far out of proportion with what she said, which was really pretty mild. Moving forward, I think where she can become vice president, I don't see that changing much. I don't see her backtracking from what she's already said, but I also don't see her making democracy and human rights in India be the pillar of her vice presidency or of her foreign policy agenda. What I do see is the Indian American space opening up much more. The Indian American community, as it has grown more assertive in American politics, it has also grown more assertive in Indian politics. And there is a tremendous amount of internal divisions amongst Indian Americans who are troubled by Prime Minister Modi's authoritarian policies and those who are very vociferous supporters of it. But because the Trump administration really doesn't care either way, it hasn't gotten a lot of national attention. I think were Kamala Harris to become vice president, that space would open up, not because of what she will say or what she will do, but because of who she is, right? And what her candidacy and her vice presidency represents, right? Eddie, I think, said something very interesting about pride replacing politics. But in this case, I think it's also a question of Indian Americans asking themselves, what are we proud of? What are we proud of as Americans? What are we proud of as Indians or as being originally from Indians? And what is it that Kamala Harris says to us, right? And that, I think, promises to be a really interesting discussion because, again, as Manisha said, the political journeys of these two countries have had several intersection points, more than we realize. And then they've had in many ways, I would say, a shared moral history. And at this particular moment, as much as these elections are an inflection point for the United States, this time is an inflection point for Indian politics and for the state of India, not because there are elections in the US, not even because Kamala Harris is running, but just because of the space that India finds itself in. And as Indian Americans kind of look to this and look to shape India-US relations, I think having Kamala Harris be there as vice president will really influence how that journey continues. And my crystal ball doesn't tell me where that journey will go, but both as someone that studies diaspora politics and as an Indian American, I'm really sort of curious and excited to see what happens. So back to you, Anna.
Excellent. So thank you, Bidisha. So we've had opening remarks now from all of our panelists. So I'm just going to give a minute to just transition over on the video. So we've heard from all of our 4 panelists, and what I'd like to do next is to see if the panelists would like to say, maybe take 10 minutes. You've already done a bit of this. You've responded to each other's comments. If you would like to respond to each other's comments, and I might particularly like to share a question that came through into my email, and maybe that would stimulate both Eddie and Manisha to start the dialogue amongst you, and then we'll start taking audience questions. So this is from Sujata Murthy from Middlebury College, and she's asking if the panel would discuss the generational differences in the diasporic experience, particularly the racial alliances that were possible in the 1960s and the present moment when comparing the political engagements of Shamala, Kamala Harris's mom. So why don't I maybe open that both to Manisha, to all of you, but it seems like in the interest of Zoom, I should call on people. So maybe if Manisha and Eddie could get started, and Ipshita, if we can just highlight the speakers as they speak, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to go on here. And I again apologize for the light flooding into my office. Now I have tilted my computer suitably so you can actually see me. You know, it's a really interesting question, the generational gap. I do think that A lot of people in the 60s and 70s that came, in the aftermath of the civil rights movement had a far more direct connection to it. Of course, Shyamalan Gopalan came earlier than that too, but that milieu, that radical milieu that she became a part of in Berkeley was clearly, part of that particular era. I think Indian immigrants and Asian immigrants as a whole make choices about how they want to be seen in this country and how they are seen. There is the traditional immigrant path that was, started with the Irish Americans and Southern and Eastern Europeans who were, quote, seen as lesser whites coming into the United States, who chose whiteness sometimes and chose it as a way to assimilate into the United States. And some Asian Americans have in fact chosen that path. They've chosen to distance themselves from African Americans. But this political history that I talked about, I think is still there. It's still pretty strong. And it gets reinforced from people's everyday experiences. So I'm thinking about, the fact that, some fundamentalists referred to Hinduism as devil worship and started asking for the removal of temples in some southern states. I remember that happened when I was doing research in the South. There are instances of Indians, that Indian grandfather in Georgia who was attacked by law enforcement for walking in his neighborhood. There are these everyday experiences that I think reinforce us that history, that shared struggle against racism in this country. So it cuts both ways. And in many times, Indian Americans are seen, quote, as the model minority because, of course, only certain kinds of immigrants were let into the United States after 1965. That also leads them to identify in certain ways. But on the other hand, the younger generation in particular are now, I think, especially with the movement for Black Lives, are far more activists than their parents, who really wanted to just do the right thing, become good American citizens, retain their contacts with India, and have their cultural and religious institutions. It's kind of a shift away from the political generation of the 60s and 70s. This younger generation, the kind that your questioner is in college, et cetera, they're an activist generation, like many of their white and Black peers. And I think they identify and probably will go back to this earlier history far more, perhaps, than their parents.
I think that's absolutely right. I think it's a complicated story to tell, because the very conversation around anti-colonial politics is complicated by what I call or describe as a Black liberal compact. When African-American politics decides to move from the diaspora to the domestic domain, in the face of the Cold War, as the U.S. is trying to present itself as the defender of democracy and freedom, and as it's like the double V campaign, right? There's a sense in which we turn to the domestic scene as a way of making the argument for our inclusion. And people like Paul Robeson, who were once considered towering figures, are now pariah figures, and we can tell a story about how that happens. And the way in which Black power has to recoup the generation, Kamala's parents, how they are part of a generation that has to recoup a period that had actually been repressed. And Black power in some ways is the repressed of contemporary American politics. I mean, we could debate that in interesting sorts of ways. And what's interesting about Black Lives Matter is that Black Lives Matter functions something like Black power, right? We keep trying to read it as a movement when Black Lives Matter is a sentiment within which a whole range of different forms of politics are articulated. So Manisha mentioned Movement for Black Lives, which is very different from Campaign Zero, which is very different from what emerged from Dream Defenders around Trayvon Martin. I mean, so there are a number of different political iterations, right? So you have some of those young Black folk in the Movement for Black Lives who are actually studying Marxism in the jungles of Brazil. You have Palestinians. I was in Ferguson, where Palestinians had come and were organizing with folk in Ferguson around Mike Brown's death. So there was an attempt to actually connect to broader movements for freedom across the globe. I was actually in Ferguson as lawyers from the law school at St. Louis was about to take the US to the World Court, an echo of a period within which Kamala Harris's parents were activists. So what's interesting, I'm interested in the Catholics data, that 16% to 28%, that is a jump. And I want to know if that jump is a reflection of a response to Black Lives Matter. Does it break down generationally, right? To see what is actually happening, right? I mean, you mentioned that it's gendered, but I want to know, is that a reflection of a response to the racial unrest that we've been experiencing? Sorry, Anu, I just kind of became a kind of questioner. I just had to ask, though.
It's perfectly good, and it allows us to get Karthik in the middle to answer, I guess.
Yeah, just quickly on that, one thing to note is that Indian Americans are among the strongest supporters of Black Lives Matter, even stronger than the national average, and even among Latinos in terms of shifting investments from law enforcement to social programs. I mean, we didn't say defund the police, but so no, I think what's going on more generally among men of, and this is something, Eddie, this is something that I want to be working on the next few days and to try to publish something out of this, is I think at a deeper level, it is either men of color who did not want to admit that they voted for Trump in 2016 and now are revealing those preferences because it's more socially acceptable. Or I think we need to open ourselves to the possibility Trump is an entertainer and he's bringing a kind of masculinity to the fore that some men of color, and it's not just about Indian Americans.
Exactly.
Right. That they, and for some of them, we actually don't see foreign policy and policy towards Asia as significant at all in the conscious vote choices that Indian American voters say. But I think that there's a certain kind of bravado that he brings and a political incorrectness that he brings that might be stirring something at a deeper level among men of color. And I think that progressives need to pay attention to that. I think this is not at all to discount the vital importance of women of color in terms of their turnout and their leadership on so many counts. But I think that we need to start thinking about a specific kind of outreach and voter education and listening strategy to men of all that talk about the white working class males. There was all of that talk after 2016. I think that was overblown. What I would say is I think it is important to think about the intersection of gender and race, even within communities of color, to think deeply about.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Karthik, and thank you. That was a good exchange with all three of you. Let me maybe ask a few questions that have come in the Q&A and inspire more people to type your questions into the Q&A. There were several questions that I have grouped together, which we've already touched upon, but I think Manisha and Karthik, and you've layered both. You've talked about generational differences, going from Shyamala Gopalan to the intermediate, the generation that's the in between generation, 40s, 50s, and then the young people who marched with the BLM movement. And this idea of both generational changes as well as gender that you brought out, Karthik, in your surveys. They both are interesting, but the questions are around, do you think Kamala Harris could help heal the racial divisions? There are also questions, one question which I'll read out. So that question was from Sam Pathak. Aditya Mohan Velu asks that while the US is going through racial unrest right now, there's an inherent prejudice against dark-skinned Indians in India and even among the Indian diaspora, which he says is a silent racism, which isn't discussed a lot. So do you think Kamala could inspire Indians and help break this bias? So a few questions all along this line of how do we think of not just race, but also color, and particularly when we think of India. Let me open that to anyone, and then Gyan, if you want to take over a few questions, I'll look through the Q&A and also ask others to put Q&A. So audience, please put your questions in.
I know I'll just jump in one quick thing on this and leave to others too. I think that in addition to colorism and anti-Black racism, which certainly exists in our communities, even though I've been pleased to see the high level of solidarity on many of these questions, we also have to talk about caste. And I'll just say this as someone who is a Tamil Brahmin, the way that Shyamala was. I think one can be anti-casteist and recognize caste privilege. And I think that is important to recognize. She is a high caste. She comes from a high caste Hindu family. And I think there's and especially, with this latest kind of powerful way of looking at race as caste in America, I think we need to dig deeper into that, what that means. What you're also seeing in the United States is, in terms of Dalits in the United States, reclaiming their power here and making sure that caste is also brought to the fore as something that we need to interrogate, something we need to dismantle, including in Silicon Valley, right? There's a caste-based discrimination suit that has been brought in Silicon Valley. So I think it's important. I do think that she does hold the potential to heal. I'm not really sure if she is the only one who's going to be doing that. I think there's so many others, right, who are biracial, who are of varying castes, who, in terms of colorism, she is lighter skinned than many South Indians and many Dalits, right, who experience this on the daily. So I think there's a lot of room there. But it's, again, I think it's more about us than about her. It's about how are we going to conduct ourselves in this conversation.
Yeah, and I would say the Indian American community has doubled since 2000, right? So that's a very, very steep increase. So the caste dimensions, the regional dimensions of the Indian community in the US has grown. And so it's not a homogenous community. And I think it's really good that we're having these conversations about the intersections between race and caste, about anti-Dalit discrimination in this country as well. And those are all a part of a diaspora community kind of finding its identity and finding its place in this country, and therefore grappling with some of its own internal divisions.
Let me say this really quickly. We're asking the question about I'm sorry, Manish, you were saying you were about this. Go ahead, please. No, please.
No, I was just following up on what Vipisha said and the sort of analogy between caste and racism, with Isabel Wilkerson's book that has become, and that sociologists were doing it from the early 20th century. Indian students coming to the United States in the 19th century remarked how racism in the United States reminded them of caste distinctions in India. So it's been there for a long time. But I think it's important to see, to be careful about what this analogy tells us, but also what it elides, right? Like all constructions, like all ideas, there are certain gaps. And here I'm thinking of some really interesting reviews of Wilkerson's book in the New Yorker by Sunil Kilnani and Arjun Rai, who actually studies caste. And to be very careful whether you're talking about, varnas and jatis and all those subcastes and hundreds of subcastes in India. Having said that, I think colorism is a huge problem in India, and it is linked actually to the problem of gender. It's women in particular who were valued for, and I think it's a bit of a heritage of the colonial era in India to value whiteness. It's there within the Black community. We know skin lightening creams are all the rage in Africa and India, and now increasingly there's a pushback against that. But I think it is also linked to the history of imperialism, that these are not simply internal choices in the communities. And I'm thinking for the pushback that comes back with people talking about, Indian gods who are actually extremely dark-skinned. And are so dark, in fact, that they are painted blue. So, in a way, it's our own Black is beautiful moment, perhaps. But I do think that this, too, is linked with the long history of Western imperialism. And Cedric Robinson, others, that people talk about racial capitalism. We think about how it is enmeshed with different power structures, different ways of allocating economic resources. These are simply not, quote, internal cultural failings. And I think it's important to actually interject all those complexities into these discussions. Otherwise, we are left with some, sort of innate notion of race, which I always kind of push back against. Eddie, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Manisha. I think, well, just to add a footnote, I think you're absolutely right about Wilkerson's cast. Beautifully written, not quite as subtle with regards to the scholarship around cast. She hasn't digested it all in the way that she should, but that's just an aside. Beautifully written, though. I wanted to just say really quickly that we might want to think about Kamala's presence as vice president as functioning as a rearguard action with regards to development. So typically in the history of this country, whenever there's a first, there's retrenchment below. So we're thinking about it as a breakthrough, but when we track it, there's always the kind of, the exceptional one, and then retrenchment below it. And so we have to be very careful in waiting, and here I'm echoing Karthik here, waiting the symbolic significance of her, if they win, of her presence as vice president in terms of its downstream impacts. When in fact, Barack Obama was elected in 2008 and we saw incredible uptick downstream of very insidious forms of racism and dislocation. So I think we need to be very, very careful in how difference is mobilized in the context of this particular racial regime to consolidate inequality, where you and I become exceptions in order to justify the rule. I think we need to be very, very careful there.
Okay, that's a very, very deep and key point, Eddie. I'm going to just ask two policy questions that came to Q&A, and then I'd like to, shift over to Gyan to ask some questions while I go through the Q&A. These two are policy questions, so maybe, and some of it has been partly answered to some extent by Vidisha and Karthik, but maybe we can begin with both of you. One is asking whether it's actually stating that Biden and Harris probably made, is that a tactical error by making comments on Articles 370, 35 and Kashmir? And I think, Vidisha, you already touched upon this and answered it. And the other policy related question, and maybe you could address these both together, is to Karthik. It's not policy, but survey related questions. It was a very curious question. What were Indian Americans' attitudes towards Hillary Clinton versus Kamala Harris? And is there a gender issue there too? Indian American men, I don't know if you have that parsed out, but these were the two questions I thought we could get Karthik and Vidisha to speak to. And then Gyan, over to you.
So just quickly, there wasn't as much of a gender gap in 2016 as you saw now. So I do need to look at the favorability data if there's a gap. No, but I think it's more about Trump and what he has been able to unleash in ways that might be more subtle than we have appreciated so far. Yeah, that's what I have to say on that matter.
And I mean, I would just add that I think Trump has done a masterful job of portraying himself as a very strong friend of Prime Minister Modi, and that has sort of played into this idea that Harris and Biden haven't been as friendly. I think it's worthwhile to remember that President Obama is the only sitting U.S. president to have visited India twice. So he and Prime Minister Modi got along just fine. So again, kind of going back to what Karthik is saying, I think Trump is just kind of initiated or developed some trajectories of thought in the Indian American community that is perhaps not totally tied to reality, but be that as it may, I think, it is what it is. And yes, it would be important for Biden and Harris if they want to pursue that vote to clear up that misconception. But as I said before, I mean, Kamala Harris's alleged criticism of what was happening in Kashmir was very, very mild. It was like 2 sentences. And it's frankly not her job to defend the Indian government and what it does in Kashmir. That's the Indian government's job. But yes, that's something that I think the campaign has to find a way to address.
Excellent. Jan, would you like to pose a few questions or take over some? I think I'll go through the Q&A. Go ahead.
Yeah. So there is a question about the extent to which Islamophobia plays a role in the attitude of Indian men towards Trump and Biden-Harris. I wanted to fold that question into a broader question relating to some of the things that the panelists have said, which has to do with history. So I'm a historian, so it's not surprising that I'm going to go there. But so the history that you people laid out, it's one which includes Du Bois, it includes Gandhi, it includes Fanon, it includes Black Liberation Movement, Black Panthers, Dalit Panthers, and that's a historical kind of a connection between anti-racist discrimination struggle with anti-colonial struggle, and where colonialism is seen itself as a form of enslavement. Now that's a struggle which is based on some ideas of justice and equality. Those are the kind of key ideas. Now, if you take that history and think of what are the kind of possibilities that Harris's candidacy opens up, what is the kind of political space, even for Indian Americans, it opens up. And there you confront, some of these issues that, Vidisha pointed out, and one of the questioners pointed out. You confront an Indian government that is absolutely opposed to those ideas and that kind of a history of justice and equality. And I was thinking, so what are the possibilities that are opened up? In December, January, throughout India and in the United States, there were a series of movements against the CAA amendment, which are directed against the Muslim minorities. And some of these movements and some of these operations were, in fact, inspired by BLM. And there was a great, sort of a developing synergy between these two. So I'm wondering, given the situation now, if you think of the kind of a possibility, not just kind of electoral possibility, but possibility in terms of movement, solidarity, and so on, what do you think this opens up in a contemporary form, what existed with, Du Bois, Gandhi, Fanon, Black Panther, and so on?
That's a really interesting question, because you're right. The mass protests in India against CAA was actually amazing to see. And mainly because I think the opposition in India is so weak. We don't seem to have a functional opposition party, or at least not putting up enough of an alternative to the Modi government. And I really think that we need to think about this in the longue durée, beyond present governments even. And if we think about it precisely the way that some of the early Black activists like Du Bois thought about it, or the way in which Lala Lajpat Rai thought about it, or Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, we need to think about that future where we are all, in fact, struggling in a broad sense for democracy and human rights. They're thinking of this editorial in the Boston Globe written by 2 Indian students, one Muslim, one Hindu, both at MIT, who went down and trained with Snake and participated in all the sit-ins in the South. And they were asked, this is not your struggle exactly. Why are you here? And they said, we see this as a global struggle for human rights and democracy. We think we need to be here. And that's the way I would see it. And the person who actually best articulated it, as Vidisha said, President Obama was the one who actually went to India twice, the one sitting Indian president. I would urge all Indian Americans, and all Indians for that matter, to actually hear his speech to the Indian Parliament. It was masterful. I mean, I couldn't do as a historian, as a professional historian. I would be hard put to the way he summoned the histories of democracy in both the United States and India. You can see it on YouTube. I have seen no more powerful visionary statement of that kind of ongoing struggle. So I would really urge people not to get caught up. And there is a certain generation of Indian Americans for whom what's most important is American policy towards India. And all the things that Vidisha said, I would reinforce them. I think for India, having a functional government in the United States is actually really important, as it is for the rest of the world, as it is for most American citizens. But, going back to the broader projects of democracy, going back to the visions that Du Bois had, even in his literary radical imagination, The Dark Princess, when he talks about the Messiah, coming from a Black man, and then Princess Kautilya, Indian princess, etc. It was complete. If you read that novel, it's actually quite amazing. The way he literally constructed those solidarities in his mind out of not much to go on. But I think we can think of a future world that will actually be closer to that than we are at this point.
I'm not convinced what Kamala's role will be yet in that. That's the thing. I understand your question. I understand Manisha's answer. I just don't know what her role will be. And I love her to death. Right? I don't know what a Biden Harris administration's response will be to that kind of energy. Because they seem to be, right, well, I'll just leave it at that. I don't know what they're going to do, how they would respond to it.
Well, Eddie, I would say that it's not about what they do. It's about who they are. I think representation matters. I think young people, older people, middle-aged people, when they see others who look like them, but look like them maybe only partially, as Kamala Harris might to a lot of Indians, it sends a message. And to me, in some ways, that's at least as, if not more important than actions, because we know that actions of politicians, once they come to office, is constrained by 100 interests. Like, we know that they're not going to change everything, but just that being changes how others see the space beyond electoral politics. And I think, a lot of what we're talking about here is not about electoral politics. It's not about who is sitting in that chair of power. It's about everyone else who's watching and taking something away from it. You seem skeptical.
Well, I'm just thinking about the 8 years of Obama in office, right? Mm-hmm. The symbolic significance of his presence, and I know BLM is in part connected to the space that he opens up, but I also know that Obama constituted a constraining force, right, on that politics. I mean, just think about what he just did with the NBA. If those players would have stayed out a couple of more days, we would have had a really serious impact. But look what he did. So it's not just, I think, the symbolic significance. I think it's also the substantive policy. No, I'm sorry, Karthik, go ahead. I know you got to.
Yeah, and I actually have to jump because I got my times crossed. But one thing I want to say, and I want to end with this, is, and actually on a pretty hopeful note, fully recognize, I think that's there. I actually think those kind of constraining possibilities, just given the realities of race and gender in America, I think will fall harder on Black women and African Americans than Indian Americans. What I actually see, I think we're already seeing, is an uptick in campaign contributions. Just like you had a kind of Hillary effect with more women, especially white women running for office, but also women of color running for office in 2018. I think you will see a lot more Indian Americans, younger Indian American women running for office, South Asians more generally. So I think, so the kind of short-term effects, I think you're going to see an uptick in campaign contribution activity, probably higher turnout among younger South Asians and Indian Americans. In the longer term, I do think you will get a lot more Kamalas, and not just Harris's, but other kinds of Kamalas running for office.
Like that, yes.
If you don't mind,
Well, on that note, we should let Karthik go, but that was a very positive, optimistic note. And I know you have another engagement. So Karthik, thank you for your participation. And we'll continue with just maybe one other question or two, but we also should be wrapping up soon. So Gyan, do you want to pick up any other question? I can pick up one from the Q&A.
Why don't you go ahead and I'll look at what else is there.
Okay. So while you were looking at the question, Anu, I was just going to jump in there because I think what you were asking is really important, that, you know, it has to be more than representation. There has to be a policy level impact. And there, you know, I have to say that, you know, I disagree with some of my friends on the left who felt that Obama had, you know, led a revolution and not just won an election. You know, he won an election within the constraints of the American democratic system, and then was faced with massive opposition. I mean, and then, you know, just the kind of racist opposition and backlash that he got was unprecedented, right? And so I do think that just in terms of policy, having a Democratic majority in Congress and president will have a huge impact. And maybe less for you and me, because, you know, I can sit and criticize, you know, the present regime as much as I want, and Trump too, but really for some people it's a matter of life and death, as we now know, right? Clearly. And I think even if we get a more sort of centrist liberal regime, it'll be a regime that will definitely create the space for the left to push. You know, I always think of abolitionists just pushing Lincoln till he gets there. And I think there is a precedent in American history, even with FDR, that people in power can be pushed. And so I'm feeling a little optimistic, Eddie.
So I think on that note of optimism, I just want to say there were a couple of questions on caste, which I think to some extent we've talked about both colorism and caste. But a point well taken that Karthik made this point before he left, that this is up to us. It's not really up to Kamala Harris to solve all these questions. And so one of the Q&A is saying, well, what about this panel? You know, how about us being even, you know, representing, and that's a good valid point. And we will take that to heart. And we actually have tried to bring as much diversity here, but this point about caste is well valid. On that point, on that note, I do want to bring up our closing slide. I want to thank all of the speakers, all of the audience that has asked these questions and hung on with us for 1.5 hours here, to say it was just an absolute delight to be serving and moderating this panel with all of you. Thank you so much. Thanks to the audience to join us this evening on a Friday, that too. And I also wanted to say that the Chadha Center is new at Princeton. We have several upcoming events that you can see on the slide. We have an upcoming event on environmental entrepreneurship. You can see how interdisciplinary we are. We had historians and political scientists. We'll hear from entrepreneurs. We'll hear about COVID and Delhi, actually from people on the ground in India. We have a wonderful panel on tech entrepreneurship from some of the leading technology entrepreneurs in India. And then a topic dear to my heart is entrepreneurship for sustainable, healthy cities in November, with potentially more events to follow on India's educational policy as well. So thank you for joining us. Please stay in touch with us. Follow us on Twitter. You can check out our website for more upcoming events. And before I sign off, I have to thank our staff. These Zoom events take a lot of effort behind the scenes. And so Ikshita, Emily, and Rachel did a fantastic job. So thank you. Thank you, Manisha. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Vidisha. Thank you, Karthik in absentia. And thanks, Gyan, for getting us all together. Wonderful event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.